In product design, as engineers, we need to define the surface finish of individual parts. Sometimes it's an aesthetic finish, sometimes it's a functional finish. Sometimes it's an identifier or an icon, and sometimes it's a grip or a texture. And we get these surface finish details typically from industrial design team. Sometimes it's kind of a high gloss lettering that's applied. Sometimes it's for identifier. But how do we call these out and how do we identify them? Well, one common method is the Mold Tech Standard. So here's a Mold Tech Standard book from Stantec Engraving. And here I'm comparing a plastic part to some of these standards. And I can use these standards to help me define kind of a typical mold finish. There's another Chinese standard called Yixang, which is also available. You can buy these books and find the standards that way. But just knowing that these standards exist and knowing where to start with your designs is a great time saver. And I've found that most products in the industry are somewhere around the MT 11000 to the MT 11030. There's kind of a low, medium, and a high textured bead blast. It goes significantly higher than that to really deep texture. And different molding companies have different standards. So Eccentric, now part of Quick Parts, has their own standards here with different materials, how those materials show up on polypropylene, TPE, PCABS, things like that. Black and white, they will show differently. But kind of the A standard is the higher grade finish, B, and then down into the textured standards. These are great things to keep in hand as you are designing so that you can feel and define what those standards are. Protolabs, another local Minnesota company here, showing some older samples of kind of a library, many different materials, many different surface finishes, but these kind of 4 to 6 texture standards are pretty traditionally selected in industry. There might be hundreds or thousands of textures available to be used, but for the most part, your parts are going to land somewhere in this range. From the SPI A1 or A2 finish, kind of the high-end polish, down to the textured, what Protolabs calls PMT2. And here, shown in rubber, it's a little bit harder to see, Santoprene being a thermoplastic elastomer, and even in kind of a clear TPE, you can see that those textures don't show up quite as well, but there's a lot of different materials and a lot of different textures, from high gloss to satin to sort of a light bead blast. And if we understand what the basic callouts are, we can be really successful as we're designing products.